Hello everybody and welcome to today's live feed. Feeling a little bit nervous as I've advertised it and a few people have said they're going to come on and watch. So, if you're here then please say hello or give me a little like so I know that you're there. So today what I'm going to be talking about are the power of stories. The power of the stories that we tell ourselves. And so I'm sort of interested to know, what story are you actually telling yourself? Are you in fact aware that you're telling yourself a story? We're going to think about where the story is coming from and whether or not it's helpful. So the first thing to sort of think about is, are you actually aware that you're telling yourself a story? Now, the way you can be aware of whether or not you're telling yourself a story is quite often the feelings. Quite often we're not even aware of what we're thinking about ourselves. But what I find with clients is that they'll come in and they'll say, I've been feeling really down this week. And we'll go back and we'll think about something that's happened to them. They can quite often say, I had a row or whatever. And when they sort of think back to that, they then think about what happened after that row. What were their feelings about it? And they began to feel really down about it. And that's because they've started to tell themselves that they're a terrible person. So that's an example of the sort of story I'm talking about. And quite often I find that when I see clients, they can come in to tell me about, a distressing series of events. But it's not so much the events that are the problem. It's the way they're thinking about their response to those events and what they're telling themselves about who they are in response to those events. And quite often when we can reframe what story they're telling themselves about themselves, they go away feeling better. So just thinking about stories, I just want to use the illustration of the newspapers. So, if you're on the sort of political left in the UK, you're probably, if you read a newspaper, it'll probably be The Guardian or The Observer. If you're sort of more right-leaning, you might think about reading The Telegraph or Daily Mail, for example. And the stories that are reported there, quite often you'll get the same story reported, but it'll be reported in a very different way, from a very different viewpoint. And obviously we call that the editorial viewpoint. And in terms of our own lives, what I'd like to ask you is, who's editing your story? What's the editorial viewpoint of your story? And is it truly you? Or is it actually a voice that you've heard in the past? Is there a voice that tells you a sort of repetition of what you've been told in the past? And that perhaps isn't the true you. That perhaps is somebody who's had a lot of influence over you, who's told you stuff about yourself. And it's that voice that we hear. And the way we can sort of, tell is the feelings that come with it. Now, it's sort of very easy in a way to sort of think to ourselves, well, that's the story, that's the truth. How can this help me? And in fact, I've talked to people who say, sort of rationally, I could maybe think that that's not true about me, but actually, it isn't really a rational thing. It's just about my feelings. And I have sometimes sort of, sat with clients and tried to confront what they're saying about themselves and tried to argue with the story. And to be honest, it doesn't really work. Some of these feelings and beliefs about ourselves can be really deep-set. So actually, rather than thinking, is this story true, it might actually be more useful to think, is this story helpful? Is it really helpful to be telling a story about ourselves? So for example, I use the example of me when I was younger. I used to go around thinking that I was a bad mother. Now, the problem with telling myself a story like that is we have this thing called confirmation bias. So we have a story that we believe. We tend to go around looking for the evidence that supports that story. And obviously, alongside thinking I was a bad mother, I sort of thought I was a bad person and it made me feel quite down. And consequently, I'd be more stressed and more ratty. And as a result of that, I'd maybe get crosser with the children earlier, rather than being patient with them. And so in a way, I was sort of proving to myself that I was a bad mother. And then I'd look back on those occasions where I'd got cross. I'd only notice, this is confirmation bias, I'd only notice the times that I got cross and think about those rather than thinking about all the times when I'd actually been okay with them and loving and helped them and picked them up off the floor when they'd fallen down, all those sorts of things. But the overriding story that I was telling myself was I was a bad mother. And actually that was a really unhelpful thing to tell myself. And what has helped over the years for me is to sort of realise actually I'm just human, that sometimes I will, not be very patient. I might lose my temper. But that's part of being human. And being able to recognise that and to forgive myself has made such difference to me. Because, instead of feeling bad about myself now, I'm able to let go and I'm able to feel lighter. And sometimes I tell my clients this story of the spaghetti incident. One day I was dishing out platefuls of spaghettis to my children, and they were standing there with their plates. And as one of them went to walk away, as children do, they just sort of lost focus and the plate just went like this, and we ended up with spaghetti all over the floor. And I really noticed it because in that instance, I just laughed. I thought it was funny. And they sort of looked at me because they expected me to lose my temper. But because I was feeling better about myself and I wasn't telling myself this story that I was a bad person, it was just funny. And I could see the funny side of it, and it was just, come on, let's get the dog, and the dog will eat it up. And isn't it great we've got a dog? And I was able to sort of see the positive, funny side of things because I felt a lot lighter. And that's why I'm talking about the stories that we tell ourselves. Because if we begin to sort of think, is this a helpful story? And if we can see it as actually a story, then that gives us the chance to tell ourselves a different story. And if we can tell ourselves a different story, that's what can make the difference to our lives. So what I'd like to ask you to remember is, what is the story that you're telling yourself? Is it a helpful story? If it's making you feel bad about yourself, then perhaps it's time to think about changing that story. And maybe think, where's this story coming from? Who's going to be the editor? Is it going to be somebody from my past? Someone who perhaps said things that they might regret now if they realise that we were thinking about them? Was it someone who's perhaps abusive towards us? And if so, is that the person I want to be the editor of my story? Is it helpful? And if it's not, if you can see it as a story, you can actually end the story. So I'd just like to say thank you for the people who've, watched all the way through, I think. Thank you for joining me. And if you've got any comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments box once the video's been posted. So thanks very much. Thanks for your support. I really appreciate it because I was really nervous. And I'll come back again next week to talk some more. Thanks very much. Bye.